I want to start where we stopped last time. A little bit of a disclaimer. I would be leading this from the position of designer. It's easier for me, but sometimes I will change my hat to the way of thinking of art or engineering or like other profession for mere examples to elaborate on some of the situations. And so, shall we start, right? We stopped at the part where you stopped prototyping, you defined the game, you pretty much understand your team, right? You know, like this is the beginning, the start of it. And we're currently at the stage where you have a lots of notes and what a lot of people call design document, a weird definition to this point. I will explain why a little bit later, not very functional. And again, people put in it like a lot of meanings, and my big issue with what people call design documents at this point is it's not really design. It's not design, or it's at the best it's very partial about the design. In most of the cases it's a codex book in a tabletop meaning about everything that exists in the game and about everything that the person and designer actually came up with. And people think differently. People like think, you know, like, so let's say we have design idea, right? I mean, like, it's a document of design idea. That's the best definition. I'll show you an example. For all of the steps on top, those are the didactic materials we're gonna be using one way or another. So you have design idea document, you know, like, I think it's the better way to think about it. You have a bunch of notes and you probably have some initial prototyping. As we discussed last time, it's important to be at the stage where you more or less understand who is available as a resource in your team, including yourself, how exactly these resources are available, who's taking money, who's not taking money, participating as maybe owners. It really depends on the team, how much everyone has from the point of view of time they would want to dedicate on this process. If you have design idea document, it means that you more or less vaguely understand what kind of games you have. A bunch of notes probably describe some of the things you intellectually and mentally and temperament wise you're strong naturally. Like, some people describe characters more, some people describe locations, so people do clever design maps and small sketches. You have some of those initial things, and initial prototyping is important because you probably at this point you're more or less understand what kind of an engine you would be using, or you're writing an engine. And again, for the simplicity, I will presume Unreal Engine everywhere here because I've been developing with Unreal for 15 years in different capacities, and it's just simple for me to exemplify Unreal in general as a platform of choice. But again, disclaimer, can be Unity, can be Godot, can be your own engine, can be whatever software. It's not important. I mean, like, what's important for us here is that you have this basic idea. Let's just presume that this Bloodlines Dynasty is currently rule set for the tabletop game is my design document. It's not perfect, and I will show you why. It starts with an introduction because, like, I'm really into the literature. It's written by the writer. I'm making like a specific exposure of just to get people involved. I'm using a specific mechanic of the storytelling and narrative, which is effectively I'm telling the story through the bits, and I'm leaving a lot for people's imagination, which is often reflected in some of my practices, like using timelines and so on. Not a lot of people do that. Some people do that. Other people just write the actual full story or a synopsis, and I'm just creating the context of existing reality with a bunch of descriptors, and then move down to fractions and characters and stuff that they use as weapons and objects, and then putting this into the story. So again, I'm showing this as an example of not a perfect document, which is highly reflective by someone who has specific pluses and minuses, just specific temperament and specific approaches to tackle one or other issue. And depending from, again, the person who writes that, the team composition, see, this is like absolutely unnecessary literary part, and then go to specific game elements, and those game elements will be quite different depending from how I do that, and depending from your specific design affiliations. All of the designers are different as well, and they use various approaches. Your document would be more convenient for different aspects and not convenient for other specific aspects. And by that I mean that this document is, for example, very good for using material for presentations, using material for external stuff, just atmospherically immerse people into the world we're doing stuff at. It's by all means it's not perfect functionally. And for the dynasty specifically, there is another 500 pages document, which is dealing with all of these issues. But this is what I'm using for example, and this is like how it's starting. And since this is a board game, then it goes into the general rules and stuff and yada yada, right? I mean, and this document is also, but it's not very convenient at the same time for art and engineering, for example. While there are design documents that would be written by much more organized people than myself, initially that would provide less exposure into the world, dedicate 100% time into the mechanic, and make it more usable and functional by art, for example, and not very usable by engineering at the same time, and not usable at all by marketing people or people who want to involve people community-wise into that. And that's absolutely normal. It's normal to have your first version to be, well, you see I have like a bunch of characters being described with all their characteristics, and stuff and things. And it's absolutely normal to have it like this specific way, because you will be rewriting the things that you're writing for many times before you get to functional documentation, because everything that you write for the first time is something that will be repurposed for specific functional use at the different parts of the pipeline, and you need to understand that. You need to be totally fine about it. Another comment that I really wanted to make here, I do think that having design document idea and a design idea document, if you will, is also much more beneficial in advance of the first iteration of concept than start with actual concept and then go into design documentation, for a couple of reasons. Because if you have defined the field, as we discussed this before, and you build this mental and intellectual feeling of what kind of the environment you're building things at, you can then extract from this existing description something into the concept more consciously than if you will get into the concept and start using a lot of conjuncture-based data to do something which is not initially connected to the vision of the author and the vision of the design of the project. I think it just makes more sense. It's not that super relevant and super essential, but I think that once you start here, I mean, it's better to have design more in a vast field. Let's say design in lore context, some tryouts of prototype wise where people have been discussing this thing just in general and trying things out, some basic prototyping, and in general just first approaches in the tryouts, because by that way you develop the feeling of what you're about to do, and you start to develop initial hypotheses based on to the actual facts, not again someone else's opinion. Tryouts and hypothesis. So while you have that, right, it's much better to go from this initial thinking, into a multifaceted perspective, proving by a bunch of different tryouts, to then start condensing this into your first initial concept, which would be based on already more data and more vision from the different people with different disciplines. So, and this is the point where, so think about it this way: you can go from bottom up, you can go from up down, and there are two very different approaches. It makes sense. There's none of them are perfect, but I think that boiling things down in general often is just more productive when you try to make something which would be the summarized core basis and then expand into a larger system. So here we would say the initial concept